Good evening, everyone. I welcome you all in another lecture in the Punjabi Diaspora lecture series. The series is being organized by the Center for Diaspora Studies, Punjabi University, Patiala. Today, we have with us Professor G.S. Sahota from the University of California, Santa Cruz. The topic of his lecture today is Misplaced Peripheries, Geopolitical Allegories, Roberto Schwarz, Rajinder Singh Bedi, and Colonial Legacies in India. To participate in the discussion, we have Aditya Bahal with us. I welcome Professor G.S. Sahota, Aditya Bahal, Professor Arvind, Vice Chancellor, Punjabi University, and Professor Gurmukh Singh, Director, Center for Diaspora Studies, Punjabi University, and all our viewers. Now I would like to invite Professor Gurmukh to formally welcome and introduce our speaker today.
ਪਰਮਸਤਕਾਰਯੋਗ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਅਰਵਿੰਦ ਵਾਈਸ ਚਾਂਸਲਰ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਯੂਨੀਵਰਸਿਟੀ ਪਟਿਆਲਾ, ਅੱਜ ਦੇ ਮੁੱਖ ਵਕਤਾ GS ਸਹੋਤਾ ਜੀ, ਡਿਸਕਸੈਂਟ ਅਦਿੱਤਿਆ ਬਹਿਲ, ਧਰਮਜੀਤ। ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਤਾਂ ਮੈਂ ਬਹੁਤ-ਬਹੁਤ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਕਰਦਾ। ਅੱਜ ਫਿਰ ਅਸੀਂ ਇੱਕ ਲੈਕਚਰ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਹਾਜ਼ਰ ਹਾਂ ਤੇ ਅੱਜ ਦਾ ਲੈਕਚਰ ਥੋੜਾ ਵੱਖਰਾ ਵੀ ਆ। ਇਹ ਸਾਹਿਤ ਤੇ ਕੇਂਦਰਤਾ ਤੇ ਨਾਲ ਦੀ ਨਾਲ ਸਾਡੇ ਇੱਕ ਬਹੁਤ ਵੱਖਰੇ ਇੰਪੋਰਟੈਂਟ ਲੇਖਕ ਰਜਿੰਦਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਬੇਦੀ ਹੋਰਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਅੱਜ ਯਾਦ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ। ਸਾਡੇ ਅਣਵੰਡੇ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਦੀ ਉਹ ਬੜੀ ਸ਼ਾਨਾਮਤੀ ਯਾਦ ਨੇ। ਫਿਲਮ ਦੇ ਖੇਤਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਾਂ ਫਿਕਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਖੇਤਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਉਰਦੂ ਫਿਕਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਖੇਤਰ ਵਿੱਚ ਬਹੁਤ ਵੱਡਾ ਨਾਂ ਨੇ, ਬਹੁਤ ਗਹਿਰੀਆਂ ਜਟਲ ਕਹਾਣੀਆਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਲਿਖੀਆਂ ਨੇ। ਸੋ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਅੱਜ ਯਾਦ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ, ਇਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਅੱਜ ਦਾ ਦਿਨ ਹੋਰ ਵੀ ਖਾਸ ਆ। ਤੇ ਇਸ ਯਾਦ ਨੂੰ ਸਾਡੇ ਤੱਕ ਪਹੁੰਚਾਉਣ ਲਈ ਸਬੱਬ ਬਣੇ ਜੀ ਸਹੋਤਾ ਜੀ। ਉਹ ਐਸੋਸੀਏਟ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਨੇ ਯੂਨੀਵਰਸਿਟੀ ਆਫ ਕੈਲੀਫੋਰਨੀਆ ਸੈਂਟਾ ਕਰੂਜ਼ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਤੇ ਉੱਥੇ ਉਹ ਇੱਕ ਚੇਅਰ ਹੋਲਡ ਕਰਦੇ ਆ, ਸਰਬਜੀਤ ਐਸ ਅਰੋੜਾ ਚੇਅਰ, ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸਿੱਖ ਐਂਡ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਸਟੱਡੀਜ਼ ਤੇ ਕੇਂਦਰਿਤ ਆ। ਤੇ ਉਹ ਇੰਗਲਿਸ਼ ਤੇ ਉਹ ਲਿਟਰੇਚਰ ਦੇ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰਸ ਨੇ ਜਿਹਦੀਆਂ ਅਫੀਲੀਏਸ਼ਨਸ ਹਿਸਟਰੀ ਆਫ ਕੌਨਸ਼ੀਅਸਨੈਸ ਐਂਡ ਹਿਸਟਰੀ ਆਫ ਆਰਟ ਐਂਡ ਵਿਜ਼ੂਅਲ ਕਲਚਰ ਨਾਲ ਨੇ। ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਇੱਕ ਬਹੁਤ ਇੰਪੋਰਟੈਂਟ ਰਾਈਟਿੰਗ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਹੈਗੀ ਉਹ ਹੈ ਲੇਟ ਕਲੋਨੀਅਲ ਸਬਲਾਈਮ, ਨਿਊ ਐਪਿਕਸ ਐਂਡ ਦਾ ਐਂਡ ਆਫ ਰੋਮੈਂਟਿਸਿਜ਼ਮ। ਇਸ ਤੋਂ ਬਿਨਾਂ ਉਹ ਲਗਾਤਾਰ ਅਲੱਗ-ਅਲੱਗ ਜਰਨਲਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਜਿਵੇਂ ਬਾਉਂਡਰੀ, ਜਰਨਲ ਆਫ ਪੋਸਟ ਕਲੋਨੀਅਲ ਸਟੱਡੀਜ਼ ਐਂਡ ਸਿੱਖ ਫੋਰਮੇਸ਼ਨਸ, ਇਹਨਾਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਲਿਖਦੇ ਰਹਿੰਦੇ ਨੇ। ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀਆਂ ਲਿਖਤਾਂ ਦਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਖੇਤਰ ਆ ਉਹ ਕੰਪੈਰੇਟਿਵ ਲਿਟਰੇਚਰ ਤੋਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਸਾਊਥ ਏਸ਼ੀਅਨ ਸਟੱਡੀਜ਼, ਕ੍ਰਿਟੀਕਲ ਥਿਊਰੀ, ਹਿਸਟੋਰੀਓਗ੍ਰਾਫੀ ਐਂਡ ਫਿਲਮ ਐਂਡ ਮੀਡੀਆ ਸਟੱਡੀਜ਼ ਤੱਕ ਫੈਲਿਆ ਹੋਇਆ। ਤੇ ਸਹੋਤਾ ਹੋਰਾਂ ਬਾਰੇ ਇੱਕ ਬਹੁਤ ਖਾਸ ਗੱਲ ਆ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਮਲਟੀਲਿੰਗੁਅਲ ਸਕਾਲਰ ਨੇ, ਤੇ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਤਾਂ ਬਹੁਤ ਇੰਟਰਸਟਿੰਗ ਗੱਲ ਲੱਗੀ। ਤੇ ਲਗਾਤਾਰ ਇਹ ਟਰਾਂਸਲੇਟ ਕਰਦੇ ਰਹਿੰਦੇ ਆ ਹਿੰਦੀ ਤੇ ਉਰਦੂ ਤੋਂ ਅੰਗਰੇਜ਼ੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ। ਇਸ ਤੋਂ ਬਿਨਾਂ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਖੋਜ ਆ ਉਹ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਨਾਲ ਜਰਮਨ, ਫਰੈਂਚ, ਇਟਾਲੀਅਨ ਤੇ ਸਪੈਨਿਸ਼ ਭਾਸ਼ਾਵਾਂ ਤੱਕ ਫੈਲੀ ਹੋਈ ਆ। ਤੇ ਅੱਜ ਕੱਲ੍ਹ ਇਹ ਪੁਰਤਗੀਜ਼ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਲੈਂਗੁਏਜ ਆ ਉਹ ਸਿੱਖ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ। ਸੋ ਮੈਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਬਹੁਤ-ਬਹੁਤ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਕਰਦਾ। ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਵਕਤ ਕੱਢਿਆ ਤੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਲਈ ਬਿਲਕੁਲ ਇੱਕ ਨਵਾਂ ਵਿਸ਼ਾ ਤੇ ਨਵੀਂ ਟਾਕ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਕਦੇ ਗੱਲ ਨਹੀਂ ਕੀਤੀ, ਸਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਸਾਂਝੀ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ, ਸਾਡੇ ਸਰੋਤਿਆਂ ਨਾਲ ਸਾਂਝੀ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ। ਮੈਂ ਇਸ ਮੌਕੇ ਸ਼ੁਕਰਗੁਜ਼ਾਰ ਅਦਿੱਤਿਆ ਬਹਿਲ ਹੋਰਾਂ ਦਾ ਵੀ ਹਾਂ। ਉਹ PhD ਕੈਂਡੀਡੇਟ ਨੇ ਜੌਨ ਹੌਪਕਿੰਸ ਯੂਨੀਵਰਸਿਟੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਤੇ ਫੈਲੋ ਨੇ ਅਮਰੀਕਨ ਇੰਸਟੀਚਿਊਟ ਆਫ ਇੰਡੀਅਨ ਸਟੱਡੀਜ਼ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ। ਬਹਿਲ ਹੋਰੀ ਲਗਾਤਾਰ ਲਿਟਰੇਚਰ ਤੇ ਪੋਲਿਟਿਕਸ ਬਾਰੇ ਲਿਖਦੇ ਰਹਿੰਦੇ ਨੇ, ਦਾ ਨੇਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਨਿਊ ਲੈਫਟ ਰਿਵਿਊ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਦਾ ਕਾਰਮਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਤੇ ਹੋਰ ਅਲੱਗ-ਅਲੱਗ ਜਗ੍ਹਾਵਾਂ ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀਆਂ ਰਾਈਟਿੰਗਸ ਇਸ ਯੰਗ ਉਮਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਕਈ ਭਾਸ਼ਾਵਾਂ 'ਚ ਅਨੁਵਾਦ ਹੋ ਚੁੱਕੀਆਂ ਨੇ। ਉਰਦੂ, ਜਰਮਨ, ਸਪੈਨਿਸ਼, ਪੁਰਤਗੀਜ਼, ਤਰਕਸ਼ ਤੇ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਤਾਂ ਹੈਗੀਆਂ ਨੇ। ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਹੁਣੇ ਇੱਕ ਪੋਇਟਰੀ ਚੈਟ ਬੁੱਕ ਮੁਕਤ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਆ ਉਹ ਛਪ ਕੇ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਆਈ ਆ। ਮੈਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਵਕਤ ਕੱਢਿਆ ਤੇ ਬਹੁਤ, ਅਸੀਂ ਕੱਲ ਪਰਸੋਂ ਹੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਸੱਦਾ ਦਿੱਤਾ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਬੂਲ ਕੀਤਾ, ਇਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਹੋਰ ਵਿਸ਼ੇਸ਼ ਤੌਰ ਤੇ ਧੰਨਵਾਦ। ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਅਰਵਿੰਦ ਹੋਰਾਂ ਦਾ ਵੀ ਧੰਨਵਾਦ। ਕਾਫੀ ਲੇਟ ਸਮਾਂ ਉਹ, ਪਰ ਫਿਰ ਵੀ ਉਹ ਆਏ ਨੇ ਤੇ ਹਮੇਸ਼ਾ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਹੱਲਾਸ਼ੇਰੀ ਦਿੰਦੇ ਆ। ਨਾ ਕੇਵਲ ਹੱਲਾਸ਼ੇਰੀ, ਸਗੋਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਹੁਣੇ ਸੁਣੋਗੇ ਕੋਈ ਨਾ ਕੋਈ ਗਹਿਰੀ ਗੱਲ ਵੀ, ਕੋਈ ਗਹਿਰੀ ਅੰਤਰਦ੍ਰਿਸ਼ਟੀ ਵੀ ਜ਼ਰੂਰ ਦੇ ਕੇ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਨੇ। ਮੈਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਵੀ ਬਹੁਤ-ਬਹੁਤ ਸ਼ੁਕਰੀਆ ਅਦਾ ਕਰਦਾ ਤੇ ਉਮੀਦ ਕਰਦਾ ਕਿ ਅੱਜ ਦਾ ਲੈਕਚਰ ਜ਼ਰੂਰ ਕੋਈ ਨਵੀਆਂ ਧਾਰਨਾਵਾਂ ਸਾਡੇ ਸਨਮੁਖ ਰੱਖੇਗਾ ਤੇ ਸਾਡੀ ਸਮਝ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਵਾਧਾ ਕਰੇਗਾ। ਬਹੁਤ-ਬਹੁਤ ਸ਼ੁਕਰੀਆ।
Thank you, Professor Gurmukh. Now I would invite Professor Arvind to share his introductory remarks with us. Professor Arvind.
Yeah, I think it's a very nice opportunity that we have two scholars who are young scholars from the diaspora community. And I was really impressed looking at the profile of Dr. Sahota. I mean, as we all know that Punjabi University Diaspora Center has set up this forum in which various kinds of talks and interactions have happened in the past. But I think today's session appears to be a very unique session. Well, I'm actually traveling, so I may not speak for long today. But so what I want to say is that what I can see is there is a clearly a different point of view of scholars who are of Indian origin and who are working abroad, particularly as faculty in different universities. The way they look at India from an academic point of view is very different from the way local scholars working within India look at India. So this kind of a cross fertilization of thought, I think, will be extremely important where somebody like Dr. Sahota interacts with a sociologist or a political scientist in Punjabi University. So I think one suggestion I have for the Diaspora Center is that we kind of all the people who have interacted from this forum over the past 2 years, we kind of try to bring them together in a single session and see how they can associate with our programs in our university in a bigger way. Because I think you need both the point of views. One is the point of view when you are very much into something, we are living inside. Another is when, by the nature of your location, you have to take a step back. So, in academic discourses, immersion and taking a step back, both are extremely important processes. And I think a synthesis of these could lead to very interesting point of views to develop. So that is one thing I wanted to say. Other than that, I'm really looking forward to today's lecture because the title itself is very intriguing and Dr. Sahota's profile I found quite interesting. Aditya Bahl, I think, is also speaking at ISER, so I got confused that he's kind of, he's the one who's the speaker because when Professor Gurmukh sent me the card, I read his name and I told him, oh, Aditya Bahl is speaking at ISER Mohali because I got that invitation also. So if he is around, maybe you should visit Punjabi University. I must tell you, you will find the interactions at Punjabi University far richer than what would happen at ISER Mohali. It's
right.
I mean,
I spent several months in the library
at my home institute, ISER Mohali. But if you are visiting this area, you must come down to Punjabi University for immersion.
Right. I spent several weeks actually. Last year, I spent several weeks in the summer.
Oh, I see. Okay. So I think very interesting session is going to unfold, and I will try to engage with it as much as I can. If I'm around in the end, I may say something. Otherwise, let's go ahead.
Thank you, sir. So now I would request Professor G.S. Sahota to begin his lecture. Professor Sahota.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Bahut hi dhanwad. I'd like to thank Dr. Gurmukh Singh and Dr. Dharmjit Singh for this invitation. I'm very pleased, very happy to be presenting in this venue. I was very inspired by the conversation we had the other day, and hope this conversation continues and the ties between our institutions become even stronger in years to come. So very thankful for this opportunity. I know it's very late there, so I think maybe I should cut the prelude to the minimum and just jump in, but as quickly as possible. The only thing I should maybe say to preface all of this is work that went towards a chapter in a book called Roberto, Schwarz, and World Literature. And they wanted, various figures working on different parts of the world to contribute. And the person who had dropped out, the person who was supposed to work on the India chapter dropped out, and that gave me an opportunity to take some work that I've been doing on Rajinder Singh Bedi off and on over the years and try to kind of compile it in the context. And this is something kind of, I think, what this diasporic context may allow. I know that Punjab has received and also given much to the rest of the world. And so maybe this is in that spirit. So that's maybe some way to kind of connect the comments with what the Vice Chancellor had just mentioned, that, you know, kind of a bringing of the two perspectives inside, outside. And I think the paper itself may do something along those lines. Maybe on another occasion, I can show you some photographs of myself kind of entering the diaspora with my father, you know, with my gutti on and things like that. And but that's for another occasion. So we'll save that for maybe, you know, some other moment of maybe a little more informal. Okay, before taking up too much time, let me just say the title, as mentioned, is Misplaced Peripheries, Geopolitical Allegories, Roberto Schwarz, Rajinder Singh Bedi, and Colonial Legacies in India. And the title actually is a play on a major work by Schwarz called Misplaced Ideas. So I just wanted to kind of reference that. That's where that's coming from. And it's written in two parts, and each part has two sections. So there's small sections, and I'm hoping. So the first part is called Southern Dialectics, and the first section is called Grafting Critical Theories from Peripheral Geographies. When the Brazilian sociologist and internationally celebrated public intellectual Gilberto Freire reflected on his travels to Western India in 1951, he remarked that a present-day Brazilian's first impression of setting foot in India is a strong sense of déjà vu. Freire's travels had been sponsored by the long-standing dictator of Portugal, Antonio Salazar, who was concerned to shore up Portugal's colonies in an era of impending imperial crisis. Yet Freire's Eastern sojourns took him some distance from the aims of his sponsor. Instead of firming up linkages between far-flung Portuguese colonies and Lisbon, Freire's ruminations drew stronger ties between the southern spheres. Colonial Brazil maintained numerous contacts with the Orient, especially with India, notes Freire, realizing that quotidian commonalities shared by India and Brazil were much more abundant than those adopted by the imperial center, that is Lisbon. Far more than Portugal, Brazil adopted many features of Oriental culture to its lifestyle, writes Freire. The commonalities that Freire recognized extended from the exchange of tropical cash crops, cashews from Brazil to India, and palm trees from India to Brazil, to architectural styles, quote, techniques of decoration, if not of construction, of its houses and churches, unquote, to everyday items, quote, verandas, Indian matting and Indian jalousies, palanquins, sun hats, fans, cool fabrics, prophylactic plants such as basil, tulsi, concave tiles, church porches as shelters against violent rain, sun, and light, certain leaves and flowers to ward off the evil eye and the noxious vapors of bad air, quote unquote. So at the end of the quote. The encounter with India reveals in uncanny ways for Freire the lost meanings of Portuguese words. In the festive uproar with which he was received alongside the Governor General of India in Coelho in northern Goa, he understood, quote, viscerally for the first time, why we Brazilians call a wild party a pagodeira. I think it's kind of like my mom, I mentioned this to my mom the other day, and she said this may be connected to the word bangara. I don't know if that's what make, you know, kind of she drew a connection with. And the 1,001 courteous attentions we are shown bring home to me in the flesh the original Oriental meaning of Portuguese words like zumbaya, salam alque, pagode, unquote. These uncanny semblances and overlapping patterns between ex-colonial societies suggest diffuse, yet real imperial intermediations, ones that in turn have implications for not only how world literature is approached, but for how an adequate critical theory might be grafted from disparate imperial geographies. Roberto Schwarz's critical oeuvre fulminates on the southern dialectical horizon between different colonial legacies like Silent Lightning, illuminating not merely the ex-colonial worlds, but the vast underlying interlinkages of the social system whose structure becomes, so to speak, the musical staff or the order beneath the disparate cultural symbols of capitalism, to borrow one of Schwarz's felicitous metaphors. He's talking about the musical staff underneath the performance or underneath the manifestation of music in this context. So it's like Bedi on the horizon, you know. So this quiet Brazilian revolution in critical theory, as Neil Larson has dubbed Schwarz's interventions over the decades, has only begun to be fathomed and explored with an eye to its, quote, implications for Latin Americanism as a whole, and perhaps no less for a theory of post-colonial culture and society, unquote. I will follow the lines of Schwarz's theoretical ramifications into the South Asian worlds of Urdu literature, with an eye especially to the narrative allegories of Rajinder Singh Bedi, a major innovator of the Urdu short story and novel in the era of anti-imperialist mobilization, nationalism, and decolonization. But here at the outset, it might be useful to tarry for a moment and survey the fissured and uneven critical terrain that impedes productive dialogue and sharing of theoretical models between, say, Brazil and South Asia, Brazil and Punjab in this, to be even more specific. Larson's reflections on these very obstacles are instructive and suggest possible ways of overcoming or circumventing them. While teaching as a professor at the University of Sao Paulo in 1995, Larson noticed the impediments that constrict the kinds of languages, histories, and normative sites for theoretical discourse that either make their way into or out of a place like Brazil. Whereas some bodies of criticism fly first class right into the curriculum of places like the University of Sao Paulo. Larson mentions the fashionable 90s icons, Baba and Spivak, for instance. Others, even from neighboring Latin American locations, let alone from another continent, southern continent, seem never to arrive. The reason for this, as Larson realized, was the existence of a narrow passageway with gate and checkpoint governed by the hegemonic market of ideas in the Euro-North American metropolis. For a figure like Schwarz to make it to South Asia would, according to this cumbersome arrangement, require providing him with the correct papers for passage into the metropolis, an institutional validation for re-export into India and beyond. No doubt this journey through the constrictive core of the imperial center's institutions may mute, distort, or dull the critical edge of the theories that are permitted to pass through. The reigning slogans and catchphrases of quote-unquote post-colonial theory issuing from those of South Asian descent may be as misplaced in the contemporary Indian context as anything imposed by colonial powers. For instance, how far does hybridity, quote-unquote, go vis-a-vis hardened caste hierarchies and religious boundaries under Hindutva? Given that, it may be worth wondering whether it might not be possible to bypass this entire arrangement and see if Schwarz could land in South Asia through some imaginary escape hatch. My affinity for Schwarz may stem from my own wariness regarding the spiritless smorgasbords of theory, quote unquote, on offer in my institutional milieu. And I just mean the general milieu, not just UCSC in particular, but widely, maybe even like the ACLA, the American Comparative Literature Association. I too wince at how operations of applying pre-given paradigms to objects whose histories have been repressed and thus resistance undone could, quote, reproduce cultural political marginalization at a global level, unquote. This is from Schwarz's writings. What I propose to do in what follows is escape, if only momentarily, from this factory of repression and distance myself from the usual discrediting of the critical value of peripheral circumstances within hegemonic value structures. Basically, I'm trying to break out of that paradigm, even of some versions of post-colonial theory, which apply mostly to the Anglophone world, and probably not even in a very expansive way. I wish to bring Schwarz into direct contact with the overlapping problematics of the colonial legacy in India from one periphery to another. This mediation via the experience of the colonized in different regions under overlapping metropolitan powers has particular benefits, foremost among which is the possibility of grafting a critical theory that resonates widely within the lesser valued regions of world literature and sheds simultaneous light on the overarching structures and operations of global hegemony. This involves hearing resonances and being sensitive to common dilemmas facing those from peripheral locations, noticing the mismatch between hegemonic norms of metropolitan zones, such as those of classical liberalism, and the concrete social realities left in the wake of imperialism, measuring and accounting for the gap between the socio-historical advances in geopolitical centers and the non-normative course taken by peripheral zones, and seeing as well that these problems common to peripheral economies of the world system condition social relations such as those of the genders and their concomitant cultural forms. It's a lot there to take on. I'll only take just a sort of one kind of thread from all of that. For modeling how to handle such an array of problems, one could do worse than retrace the critical steps of Schwarz, whom Perry Anderson has called, quote, the finest dialectical critic since Adorno anywhere in the world, unquote. The task is akin to that imagined by Freire with respect to fruits and flora common to Luso-tropical cultures, the Portuguese tropical zone. Brazilian expertise regarding cashews, Freire urges, should be made known in India. And, quote, conversely, Brazil would benefit from a knowledge of the modern Indian techniques for improving mangoes through grafting. He loves mangoes, so he's very concerned about Brazilians getting the best of Indian mangoes. Impressed by the heart-shaped Indian mangoes known as Afonsas, Colaças, and Fernandinas, Freire urges their adoption in Brazil, knowing that this will require learning new techniques. By misplacing cultures of the periphery and grafting their experiences onto each other, Brazil onto South Asia onto Brazil, it might very well become possible to gain critical perspective on the limitations of reified metropolitan views, such as those of Jürgen Habermas, who admitted that the silence of the Frankfurt School under his custodianship regarding the ex-colonial world was deliberate. Acknowledging that the Frankfurt School has generally neglected the peripheries of the capitalist system, an interviewer asked Habermas whether, quote, conceptions of socialism developed in the course of anti-imperial and anti-capitalist struggles in the Third World have any bearing on the tasks of a democratic socialism in the advanced capitalist world. Conversely, does your own analysis of advanced capitalism have any lessons for socialist forces in the Third World? Unquote. This is what Habermas was asked. To this, Habermas replies, quote, I am tempted to say no in both cases. I'm aware of the fact that this is a Eurocentrically limited view. I would rather pass the question, unquote. By passing and being allowed to pass the question, Habermas does an injustice to the wider legacies of critical theory, as well as to the struggles and predicaments of the ex-colonial world. The current effort of grafting a critical theory as rich and various as Indian mangoes is meant as a corrective, one that displaces a solipsistic center, meaning Europe as a solipsistic center, informed by Schwarz's own work, which opens novel horizons of critical and practical possibility, new locations, new panoramic vistas, new distinctions of taste even. This essay advances upon zones left overlooked, if not rendered effectively and unduly verboten by the likes of Habermas. So that's the end of the first section. And you can see that Schwarz there is kind of a corrective to the way in which the Frankfurt School developed in Frankfurt itself. And now there's a lot of debate as to what the second or third generations were. Are they even located in Frankfurt? Given that there's much more sort of synergy and much more kind of, I think, impact and richness and for the current conditions in the world than what you find in Frankfurt itself? So this is an interesting question that people are grappling with. Part 2, or Section 2, splicing Candido and Adorno, disjunct critical legacies, and the dialectic of generality. We get into some of Schwarz's kind of terminology. Okay. What makes Schwarz's writing so generative for other peripheral locations, such as those of mid-20th century Urdu, needs to be briefly expounded. This is his capacity to bring into dialectical intensity the disjunct critical legacies of his mentor Antonio Candido on the one hand, and the potentialities latent in the works of Theodor Adorno on the other. From Candido, Schwarz acquired a sensitivity to the predicament of writers and critics in peripheral zones, such as 19th century Brazil. Here, as in India, the processes of underdevelopment necessitated by the expansionary dynamic of capital fail as a rule to reproduce the social conditions that would match the normative course of development and concomitant cultural forms of the metropolis. So that just happens just by its own operations, this disjunct. In his seminal 2-volume Formação da Literatura Brasileira from 1959, Candido modeled for Schwarz how to follow the anomalous formal logics that issue from the distinct historical courses of development of peripheral zones, far from the institutions of bourgeois life prevalent in the imperial centers. From an enduring engagement with Adorno, Schwarz became apprised of the potentialities of not enclosing oneself in metropolitan high culture, a cultura canonizada. Adorno, after all, investigated debased popular forms more rigorously than banked on by the industrialists and marketeers of mass culture. Instead of stuffy aloofness, Adorno urged one to be alert to the contradictory currents of culture in all its variety, especially the manner in which its formal consistencies and inconsistencies index, quote, an unconscious historiography of our times, unquote. Spliced together, Candido and Adorno set Schwarz in motion towards some of his fundamental theoretical categories, most significant among which is socioaesthetic generality. What is that combines the social level and the aesthetic? Where do they kind of meet and find their sort of point of mediation? I will take each on in turn, laying out the implicit cues for reading Bedi in India, to whom I will turn in the second part of this presentation. Schwarz's spirited engagement and defense of his mentor's critical legacy bring out the qualities that he values in not merely Candido, but in literary study more broadly. I should say a little bit about Antonio Candido. He lived a long life, almost 100 years, and seemed to kind of really break out of the kind of models of literary theory that were dominant in the Western world, and kind of did something which really spoke to the specificity of the Brazilian experience. And I think that's what I think Schwarz really took from him. And he also Schwarz was Candido's student. So this is a kind of long, very interesting collaboration that took place over several decades. Rereading a variety of essays and interviews over his career, we can glean the key traits that Schwarz cherished and wished to propagate. 3 in particular stand out, each imbued with what Schwarz recognized as Candido's guiding hatred of oppression, quote unquote. Acquired from an intimate knowledge of 2 mutually contradictory spheres from his childhood in the early 20th century, that of ex-slaves and their ostensibly civilized bourgeois superiors. As you all know, Brazil had slavery until the last decade of the 19th century, so it really has the much longer history of slavery than other parts of the Western world, the Americas. All are marked by a sensitivity to the cultural predicaments of capitalist peripheries. The first trait, then, is a solid foundation of integrative criticism, one that drew together disparate everyday experiences in Brazil and built upon the insights of predecessors. Moreover, Candido incorporated into his designs for the University of Sao Paulo's Department of Literary Theory critical developments from 5 major world centers: England, North America, Germany, Italy, and France, allowing him and his students to overcome a reigning provincialism and participate in international debates. This signature integrative approach culminated in Candido's sociologically grounded retracings of a large-scale historical structure that signaled the gradual formation of a national literature distinct from the colonial order from which it had evolved. So Brazilian literature breaking off from Portuguese, meaning the literature of Portugal. The second major trait Schwarz highlights in his reflections on Candido's method is one that captures processes of cultural accumulation. Candido had an eye for tracing the manner in which an autonomous cultural bloc slowly evolves through forging continuities, reversals, and inversions of previous literary or cultural models, establishing a living tradition in the process. Of course, we see this all the time in India. If you follow, it's an internal, very rich accumulation of tropes, of forms, of certain kinds of aesthetic styles. That is, Candido was able to grasp the actuality of the past in his literary subjects while exemplifying such an actuality for his present-day readership. This way of capturing cultural specificity through a logic of accumulation opened the way toward an overcoming of reified understandings of particularity and universality stemming from metropolitan zones. This last quality can be organized under the rubric of counter-hegemonic inversion. Schwarz notes that in his most complex essays, such as Dialectic of Malandroism and the still untranslated De Cortiso a Cortiso, From Slum to Slum, and this dialectic of malandroism is like the dialectic of this figure of like the ruffians of the colonial world of Brazil. The ruffians who aren't bourgeois, they aren't slaves, they're sort of in a different kind of trajectory of historical becoming. These path-breaking texts, quote, these path-breaking texts in which forms and concepts from the Western tradition are examined in light of Brazilian reality, relativizing them and imparting to them the inflections of a particular history, unquote, marks something radically new. So instead of Brazil being viewed under the gaze of Portugal, now things are reversing. They're looking at Portugal from a kind of vantage point of Brazil that has its own specific accumulation of critical theory or critical terms, critical viewpoints. Quote, the Western tradition measures Brazilian reality and in turn is measured by it, Schwarz notes the dialectical fallout of this back and forth movement. Quote, Brazilian experience becomes universal and identifies itself in its originality, which may be positive, but negative too, or even hateful. So it's not always a great thing, but at least it's something, it's distinctive. With such dialectical provocations already present in Candido's work, we approach the point at which Schwarz's oeuvre begins to seamlessly splice in Adorno. So these are the two figures, Candido and Adorno, kind of brought together under Schwarz and Schwarz's work. Though their critical languages and backgrounds may differ, both Candido and Adorno concur in formulating critical models governed by the specificity, indeed, even at times radical singularity of the cultural artifacts under analysis. Furthermore, both thinkers assiduously seek to delineate points of articulation between cultural form and historical material. There is much that links Schwarz's conceptual underpinnings to the extensive groundwork established by Adorno, but for present purposes, I will underscore Adorno's notion of the sociality of aesthetic form and its elaboration by Schwarz. Adorno's aesthetic theory reflected down to its innermost tensions the social and political dynamics that define late capitalist times, bringing to a point of crisis the very notion and possibility of the work of art. With a thesis that, quote, form is the locus of social content, unquote, Adorno sees form as not a universal or transhistorical constant, but rather as imbued with socio-political dynamism, having embedded within it a potentiality to separate itself off from the workaday world and imagine a different one. The work of art for Adorno is charged with negativity. Art is thus, quote, the social antithesis of society, unquote. Such a profound, very nice phrasing. The moment when art is in crisis, the possibilities of human freedom, including those of the imagination, are also likely falling under strain. This is merely one instance in which questions of form for Adorno reveal dimensions of sociality that otherwise do not or cannot attain expression. A social aesthetic that overlooks formal qualities or is content with pre-existing ones may stumble past and miss the true levers of social change. For, quote, real denunciation, as Adorno puts it, is probably only a capacity of form, unquote. So if you really, it's not through just denouncing it, you have to invent another form for the denunciation of the reigning conditions of society. Simultaneously, an index of imminent potentialities for lessening social suffering and the spontaneous divulgence of a haunting promesse de bonheur, a promise of happiness, art for Adorno reveals itself as a ghostly artifact of social labor. Even in moments of total seclusion, the artist is not alone. Quote, by constantly admitting into the production of his work an element of negativity toward his own immediacy, the artist unconsciously obeys a social universal. In every successfully realized correction, watching over the artist's shoulder is a collective subject that is yet to be realized, unquote. Such forceful ruminations on the social dimension of art captivated Schwarz's interest from his early 20s when he wrote to Adorno expressing interest in attending his lectures on aesthetic theory. In 2003, Adorno's centenary, Schwarz expressed his indebtedness to the German critical theorist, as well as Candido, in an elucidating interview. Over the course of this conversation, Schwarz clarifies many salient points relating to Adorno's enduring actuality, meaning still present with us. Foremost among which is his theory of aesthetic form, as expressed most powerfully in musicological metaphors. And I'm turning soon to Bedi, but one last section here, or part here. Schwarz takes interest in a personal note in which Adorno, quote, admits to holding the conceit of comprehending the language of music just as a hero of fairy tales comprehends the language of birds, unquote. The intriguing analogy is of interest to Schwarz for what it seems to suggest about form. If we place form where music is written, this is Schwarz, we will have something of the attitude of Adorno as a critic, who in fact seeks to know what the forms are expressing, reacting to them as expressions of contemporary society regarding what is most problematic and decisive. It is in, unquote, it is in Schwarz's appreciation of the care and analytical acuity with which Adorno scrutinizes the formal consistencies and inconsistencies of works of art that we can make a connection with his notion of form as, quote, the structural reduction of a social situation external to literature, belonging to history. So that the work of art sort of receives a kind of, it feels the impact of this social dynamism deep within itself, kind of registers it. And what this approach has to offer, the interpretation of the cultural forms emanating from the peripheral zones, where reigning metropolitan ideas are often out of place, and where imitations of hegemonic forms or norms are likely to go awry. So even if people in the peripheries are trying to imitate what is sort of dominant in, say, Lisbon or Portugal, it's because of the context and the environment, it won't take shape in the same exact way. It'll also be a kind of, it'll go awry. Here, attention to consistencies and inconsistencies of form may be most revealing. Indeed, the principle of generalization, the point of mediation between the wider society and aesthetic form in Schwarz's Marxist hermeneutics, helps to point out where reality and fiction both abide by a common logic, one that makes both society and art intelligible within themselves and with respect to each other. How are the dirempted, split, dirempted, incomplete, or inconsistent moments of cultural forms in the peripheries to be understood? What political or social meanings or possibilities find themselves transmuted into the particularities of peripheral forms? What are the circumferences of allusion and allegorization of these non-canonical developments in the hinterlands of capitalism? Of course, each situation will demand different kinds of investigation and suggest different answers. Yet Schwarz's attunement to these questions in the works of Joaquim Maria Machado de Assis, a great writer of 19th century Brazil, are suggestive of possible matrices. With respect to posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubas from 1880-1881, the central object of study in Schwarz's magnum opus, A Master on the Periphery of Capitalism, the novel's unusual formal qualities capture the structural implications of the historical picture. Far from bringing Enlightenment notions to fulfillment, the periphery is the zone where they are purposely travestied, serving ulterior purposes. Quote, literary form and unjust social relations rigorously fit one another, notes Schwarz. Quote, so that investigating one of these poles implies fixing the dimensions of the other, unquote. So you sort of see the social forms of injustice actually start to inform or give form to the literary work that, say, a figure like Machado is engaging with. Okay. Serving more as a model to allow for liberated forms of critique, ones that take their cues from aesthetic particularities, rather than a fully formed method to be bluntly applied to an objecthood void of distinctive qualities. So not the cookie cutter approach where you just have a theory and you sort of smash it down onto the object, making that object so hapless, kind of like forcing it into confines for which it may not really be suited. So rather than a fully formed method to be bluntly applied to an objecthood void of distinctive qualities, we can turn now to the world of mid-20th century Urdu literature to see whether a principle of generality obtains between the dirempted aesthetics of Bedi's fiction and the peculiar course of development of his home state, Punjab, under British occupation. So I'll turn now to part 2, which is called Generality and the Split Allegories of Rajinder Singh Bedi. This also, as I mentioned, has 2 sections. The first section is called Gender and the Janus phase structure of colonial Punjab. So finally, we're in Punjab, and but I am hoping that this Schwarz's approach will sort of resonate with scholars now, and this is maybe one of those points of intersection that the Center there for Diasporic Studies may sort of make possible. So that's why this is all very exciting for me personally. A fascinating interview with a progressive Urdu short story writer and scenarist of the Bombay film industry, Rajinder Singh Bedi, who's around from 1915 to 1984, sheds light on the predicaments facing the writer on the peripheries of the capitalist system from a variety of angles. Published in the journal Mehfil in 1972, the conversation with Bedi traverses a range of topics. He candidly remarks in passing on the difficulties of making a living as a writer in the Urdu language, the variety of threats to artistic integrity coming from a highly politicized cultural arena, and the difficulties in the formation of the novel in Urdu, a crucial sign of reaching cultural modernity in the wider international arena. Relatedly, he comments on the tumultuous language politics in the new nation states of India and Pakistan, which have rent the once unified tradition of Urdu literature so thoroughly as to render it impossible as a medium of cohesive national expression. It's the impact of partition. Added to this slew of problems is the menace of appropriation of one's work by hegemonic powers of the Cold War, whether the USSR or the USA, not to mention the distortions of one's literary voice on account of compromising translations, into more dominant literary languages. Within this ambit of topics, he consistently asserts his keen interest in sharpening his capacities for an individual style and form best suited to capturing the predicaments of his own social milieu, the generally hidebound lower middle classes of Punjab. That's his world. It was this very desire for freedom of expression that got him involved in the Progressive Writers Association, the Taraki Pasand Adab, a loosely organized cultural front of the left founded in colonial times or in colonial India. The incongruities of a radically modernist political aesthetics on the one hand, and a fairly inert social milieu of the lower middle strata of Punjabi society on the other, make for particularly stimulating, even colliding encounters between form and content. Bedi seemed to understand that the clash was inevitable, acute, and indeed defining for his times. His intimate knowledge and insights into the inertia of familial structures, the habitus of patriarchy, the apparent weight of custom would clash with the more transformative aspirations, ethos, and modes of representation espoused by himself and others in the progressive milieus, progressive currents of the decades leading to and beyond independence and partition. Thus, the contrast between the inheritance of everyday domestic, especially female misery on the one hand, and the modernism of his voice, style, and formal experimentation could not be starker. As we will examine with reference to the story Grahan, or eclipse, in the following section, embedded in his form is the potential for actual reversal of authority between men and women, which here presses up against traditional institutions and practices maintained and prolonged by the colonial power and succeeding neo-traditional authorities. But for the moment, it may be instructive to step back and provide a small snapshot of the kinds of social contradictions that define colonial rule in Punjab, if not India more broadly. The conflicting modalities of colonial statecraft, custom, stability, and order on the one hand, and the potentially destabilizing imperatives of the civilizing mission, the market, social progress, and liberal freedom on the other, impacted Indian society at a variety of levels and scales, reaching down into family structures and gender relations. So you have this Janus face is looking two opposite ways: stability, custom, traditional order, the civilizing mission, the market, reform, progressive kind of capitalist bourgeois politics on the other. And they're colliding in India under colonial times all the time. The late colonial situation in which Bedi came of age can be described as diametrically opposed to that of ancient Rome. Hegel remarks in The Philosophy of Right that, quote, in Roman law, there could be no definition of man, since slave could not be brought under it. The very status of slave, indeed, is an outrage on the conception of man, unquote. We would say the human now. Whereas in Rome, slavery was widespread, thus negating the notion of general man or a general kind of humanity. In India, the notion of equality was circulating, bringing into sharp relief the conditions of everyday life where servitude was deeply embedded. That is, in modern India, the idea of equality was in circulation, but only in contradistinction to the reality, both formally and substantively speaking. Once the idea of the human had attained a presence in late colonial politics, much of the immediate present could be experienced as an outrage, especially with respect to those in servitude, women especially, if not generally. To get a sense of the formal structures through which Bedi approaches the plight of women in his midst, we can briefly follow the social logic that left them entrapped within servitude in a moment of burgeoning discourses, possibilities, and indeed, with the expansion of the commodity form, norms of equality. So you see this clash occurring. This is a very fascinating point to observe with respect to Bedi's work. Among the historians who have shed light on the Janus-faced nature of colonial rule in India, three in particular help to illustrate the fundamental concentration and its fallout: Andrew Sartori, David Gilmartin, and Niladri Bhattacharya. Whereas Sartori's work helps ground liberalism, indeed the very presence of liberal thought in the colonial hinterland, and one's quote, in one specific dimension of capitalist society, the sphere of circulation, unquote. Gilmartin's account describes how imperial rule thwarts the radicalizing potential of liberal property laws for the sake of stability, leaving liberal ideals in the colony merely ideational, yet persistent presences before the fact of colonially sanctioned custom. Bhattacharya helps delineate the consequences of colonial customary law in Punjab for women. So it's a very quick, kind of brief sort of review of literature. From Sartori's account in Bengal and Global Concept History, it's the title of his book, we can glean a sense of apprehension and alarm among colonial officials as colonial experiments in social transformation took root with expansion toward Punjab. For instance, Sartori cites Sir Charles Wood, Secretary of State for India, who stated the problem flatly in 1866, quote, I am firmly convinced that our permanent hold of India would be fearfully loosened if the cultivating population felt that their customary rights were in danger, unquote. So this is the contradiction coming to a head. The secretary's concern was shared by many colonial administrators in the wake of the implementation of the permanent settlement in Bengal in 1793, and the instability of its abstract notions of exclusive proprietary right over land had wrought for colonial rule. Sartori's work has illuminated the vernacular valences that began to absorb the new liberal dimensions of the market mediated by colonial rule. Not only did the theology of Advaita Vedanta become, in Rammohun Roy's hands, quote, a doctrine of liberal egalitarianism, unquote, but the logic of commodification and legal codes of commerce penetrated deep into the fabric of Bengali cultural forms. For instance, relatively autonomous groups such as the Kartabhajas and the Sahibdanis employed, quote, the logic of commercial society to articulate a political, social, religious, and ethical imagination, unquote. So liberal thought is seeping even into the vernaculars, sort of the local zones of Bengali society. Sartori picks up on the potential for the elaboration and travel of key abstractions intrinsic to the nature of liberal categories and their predication on the abstraction of exchange from use value. He elaborates, quote, liberalism certainly did not have to await the emergence of a full-blown market society to find its voice. After all, liberal politics advocated as its central social, economic, and political program the extension of free exchange as a model of human interrelations at the expense of other dimensions of the existing forms of social organization. It's a little bit complicated, but what he's, I think, saying is that you have a certain kind of model now that becomes normative for how people should interact, and that's a kind of a liberal model. And that stems from the sphere of circulation in capitalist society. So we can talk about that in more detail later. Considering the revolutionary havoc and the logic of the market, that the logic of the market could bring to colonial rule, colonial administrators in Punjab devised countervailing strategies. Henry Lawrence, C.L. Tupper, and Richard Temple in Punjab sought to buttress the mitigating customs of rural life. So they understood, even those in Punjab, you can imagine the whole sort of wave of colonization stretching from Bengal across the Gangetic Plains towards Punjab, and the figures who are becoming the potentates and sort of the effective rulers, colonial rulers of Punjab already understand that this contradiction is going to hit them soon. So they're kind of, it's very fascinating to see that they kind of see what's coming. And they sought to shore up customary patterns to secure imperial longevity. So they knew that the task before them was to make sure that custom stayed intact against the norms of the market, yet the colonial state implements the market norms. This antinomian structure of British colonial rule comes to a head in the thrust of Punjab's Alienation of Land Act of 1900. And of course, everyone here knows all about this. Though scholarship on this significant piece of legislation is now fairly extensive, David Gilmartin's Empire and Islam, Punjab and the Making of Pakistan best delineates the conflicts underlying it and the consequences it foretold in terms of modalities of political mobilization in the late colonial period. He follows in the wake of observations such as those of David Washbrook. The Anglo-Indian, quote, the Anglo-Indian legal system was distinctly Janus-faced and rested on two contradictory principles with different social implications, whereas the public side of the law encouraged the emergence of free market relations. Personal law under the British encouraged the preservation of ascribed traditional status. In this regard, the law was an indicator of the conflicting purposes of colonial rule itself. The direct, paternalistic style of administration of the Punjab school led to the redaction of customary law by Tupper and the production of, quote, a class of rural leaders tied closely to the administration, meaning the colonial administration, exercising its authority largely in a tribal, i.e. customary idiom, unquote, by the end of the 19th century. Yet over the same period, colonial policy in Punjab had introduced the market conditions for an undoing of customary relations, including potentially the overturning of the widely shared custom of prohibiting inheritance of land by daughters. Gilmartin explains, quote, a late 19th century crisis of indebtedness among Punjabi landholders precipitated the passage of the Alienation of Land Act in 1900. To many British officials, the large-scale expropriation by moneylenders of peasants' land struck close to the heart of British rule, undermining rural stability. Widespread land alienations, many feared, would lead to rural revolt. At its core, however, the issue hinged on the conflict they perceived between a stable agrarian society on the one hand and the free working of natural economic laws on the other, natural in the sense of what Adam Smith or the kind of what a kind of under bourgeois political economy would be considered natural. So that's, I just want to specify that. So the colonial states ruling in favor of custom would have repercussions at every level of Punjabi psychic life, shaping a sense of disjointed time and place in the works of modern writers such as Bedi, as we will see below. And then one last historian here before turning to Bedi. Niladri Bhattacharya's The Great Agrarian Conquest covers the complex history that culminated in the consecration of the patrilineal principle in the customary law of Punjab, and how this rule of customs systematically displaced the rights of women. Quote, within closed, exogamous, patrilocal communities, the exclusion of women's inheritance was seen as necessary to sustain the cohesion of village society and the premises of its existence. To grant inheritance rights to women who moved out of the village was to threaten the control of the brotherhood, the biradri, over village land. It was to allow the transmission of property to an outsider, unquote. So that's Bhattacharya. Women had effectively been rendered an outsider when it came to property rights, relating what was most crucial in an agrarian economy, land. So with respect to property rights, women were excluded, and that was revolved around land, the most important of all the commodities or emerging commodities. For the implications of this Janus-faced social logic for women, we can now turn finally to Bedi's fiction. Okay, so that was a long sort of preface to this reading of just one short story. And there are questions we can discuss all that which just preceded, I think. Okay, last section, generality of myth and history in Eclipse. Published in 1942 as the title story of his second collection, Grahan, Eclipse, thematizes the plight of a pregnant housewife of a joint family in contemporary India, evoking her longing for freedom from the routine abuse she suffers at the hands of her in-laws. But as the events of the narrative coincide with a lunar eclipse, replete with ancient Hindu rituals and mythology, the story simultaneously evokes the eternally unchanging patterns of the universe. What is the relationship between these two levels of this unique narrative, which seems to move so seamlessly from the pole of history to that of myth, that it's difficult to tell whether the concrete story is the allegory of myth or myth the allegory of history? That is to say, the story raises the following questions through its own inner workings. What does it mean for the everyday, concrete world of experience, of history where it hurts, to be enclosed so completely by myth? Or, to see it from the opposite point, how is the mythic able to encompass and completely encircle and entrap the realm of human agency and historical possibility? Will the mythic always eclipse female agency, or will that last only as long as an eclipse, as it only takes minutes before the planet, the demon Rahu, swallows to pass through his severed throat and back to its natural state? Considering this narrative against the backdrop of the social history in which Indian women's rights were eclipsed by the colonial rule of custom, it becomes possible to index the moment of generality, or the point at which the narrative form and social form align. So finally, we get to that point of Schwarz's generality as the two coming together. And here, I want to point out just really briefly that I'm interested in sort of making clear that this is the colonial rule of custom. It is not actually Punjabi custom, which would have had its own genesis, its own dynamism, its own potentiality, its own sort of set of possibilities, and that's what was blocked by the colonial sort of context. Eclipse takes us immediately into the universe of Hindu culture, in which, amidst a routine of everyday drudgery, the domestic dramas between wife and husband, or mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, unfold in the minutest of ways with the grandest of consequences. At the center of the narrative is Holi, to whom we are introduced only after we are given the names of the 4 sons she has already borne to the clan to which she has been married off. She has another one on the way. About this, she is constantly hounded by her mother-in-law and others of her husband's family, who only see her as a kula vadhu, the traditional wife whose sole role is to produce male progeny. Her mother-in-law nags her about all the superstitious restrictions posed by the looming lunar eclipse that is occurring that day. No permission, for instance, to tear any cloth, lest the ears of the child in her stomach be torn as well, unquote. The fact that she is forbidden to write even a letter to her parents back home in a village just 25 miles downstream makes her long for their care and the company of childhood friends. When not being berated by her mother-in-law, she must fend off the brute advances of her husband, Rasila. As the eclipse approaches, she ponders the ugly image of the planet-swallowing demon and is reminded of Rasila, of her own husband. And how strange is Rahu's visage, a black demon mounted on a lion. He appears so fearsome. Rasila also looks just like Rahu, unquote. This identification makes Holi long for home all the more. That evening, amidst the raucous ceremonies that accompany the eclipse along the town's river, she is able to break free of her in-laws' clutches and run into runs onto a small steamer set in the direction of her home village. So she's on a ship. Aboard, she finds herself vulnerable among the employees manning the ship. Yet among the louts, she recognizes a childhood friend, Kathoram, who promises to get her home so long as she stays with him in an inn for the night. Her spirit sagging, she acquiesces, only to have to run out into the night to escape his drunken lust. If Rasila is explicitly identified with Rahu, Kathoram is implicitly with Ketu. So you have the two, Rahu and Ketu. The story the story closes with Holi being pursued by two indistinct shadows, hounding her as the demons Rahu and Ketu go after the sun and the moon. If one were to trace the complex, indeed twinned narrative structure underlying the story, in which the mythic eclipses the historical and the historical the mythic, one would be led to the socio-historical reality underlying the impasses facing Holi. So this is all just a reflection of that deeper social kind of logic of the colonial state and its legacy. Quote, mysterious are the ways of the gods, thinks Holi, as conveyed by the narrator, whose deep sense of irony signifies that he or she does not share in the worldview presented in the narrative diegesis. You get a sense of this, real separation between the perspective of the narrator as opposed to the figure, how the people within the story think. There's a real interesting kind of divide at that level. Holi recalls the myth surrounding the eclipse inherited from ancient lore. Quote, disguised, Rahu was blissfully savoring the divine nectar. The sun and the moon informed Lord Vishnu of this sacrilege, and God Vishnu, with his divine discus, sliced Rahu into two pieces. The head and torso flew up into the sky and became Rahu and Ketu, respectively, actually. Now, twice every year, they wreak vengeance on the sun and the moon, unquote. While the perspective of the pregnant wife's quandaries and desires for escape establishes a liberal, even radical sensibility, the substance of the reality depicted, bound to myth and ritual, speaks of the customary structure maintained by the colonial order. The diegetical and extra-diegetical gap of the narrative, with its competing temporal planes in which human agency and mythical metaphysics remain in perpetual antinomy, kind of in clash, begins to resemble, if not encode, the very real social logic that had begun to doubly bind the prospects of womanhood in colonial India. Holi cannot escape either way she turns. Twin demons eclipse her freedom in both directions, whether the oppressive customary structure or the illusory realm of liberal freedom. That's the end of that section. There's a small coda that brings Brazil and India back together. In grafting critical theory from peripheral locations, like Freire's much savored Indian mangoes, it becomes possible to imagine a process of cultural accumulation beyond the borders of a nation. So basically I'm saying that take Brazil and India combined, we're no longer within the realm of the nation state. The accumulation now becomes much more collective, much more with greater potentialities for social change, I believe. So it becomes possible to imagine a process of cultural accumulation beyond the borders of a nation. If, as Schwarz believes, the possibility of being shipwrecked appears, quote, to be the destiny of the greater part of contemporary humanity, unquote, making it no longer a second order of experience, then the task of cultural criticism is to think about inversions of already existing nation-based and regionally tied accumulations for the naufragios of the world, the shipwrecked of the world. A critical theory that neglects to orient itself to those for whom previous accumulations have produced little fails to live up to its name. It's not critical theory. Perhaps the most appropriate way to read Schwarz then for world literature is as one who offers a methodology for deriving possible alternatives from within existing worlds. In other words, as one whose own accumulation leads, like that of Machado's, the great Brazilian novelist and short story writer, to a critical inversion. And that's the end of the essay. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor G.S. Sahota ji, for such an engrossing talk, and for sharing with us how someone like Roberto Schwarz could be of great help to all of us who are situated in South Asia, and how his work and legacy can help us to escape the twin prisons of Western epistemology and the controversial legacies of post-colonial theory, the manner in which it has been practiced till now. And there has been a serious critique of the legacies of post-colonial theory. So thanks a lot. Now I would request Aditya to share his observations on Professor Sahota's talk. Aditya.
Hi, Wali. Yeah, that was great. Yeah, thanks so much. Dharamjit actually shared your essay with me, so I also had the opportunity to read while you were reading out. And I mean, there is something that, of course, you notice when you're reading, but also more so on the page, is that when you speak of form, there is also like a lot of effort that you put in crafting your own essays, that I feel that, like every paragraph is like, or every section is a certain kind of like tries to capture a certain drift of a certain thought experiment in a certain way, whether historical or whether speculative, or, and I was wondering, when you speak of form, thinking of Schwarz, I was also thinking of the form of your own experiments in essay writing. And I was wondering if you could just like talk to us a little bit about these essays that you've been working on, because once you had mentioned that you've been trying to, because you speak so much about inversion here, that you're trying to invert Adorno's minima moralia into maxima moralia. And that's something that has always stayed with me. And because there is like form here and inversions here, and I was wondering if you could just like talk a little bit about, like, is this part of a larger project, or just essay as in form? What does that mean to you?
Okay, that's an interesting question. I haven't really thought so much about this, but one thing, I think I enjoy in reading other people's work, some of my favorites, probably just from this essay, who some of those might be, is that there's a kind of energy that keeps moving. There's a kind of sense that it's not arbitrary. Arbitrary thought becomes somewhat bludgeoning, boring even, and you want to just throw the book down, right? It's as if like you can have so many arbitrary thoughts in your day that don't add up to anything, little factoids or observations or aperçus. In the end, they just seem trivial. And I think the kind of dialectical theory that I find, or even to theories of the dialectic, that I find so fascinating and taken by, kind of puts you in the train of a thought that's going somewhere, that is actually kind of productive. And you don't know if it's actually coming straight from your mind or if it's coming from the material itself. It's actually that point of intersection that I find so valuable. And if you can find that point of intersection, that you can be led by the object, and you're almost kind of just tracking the logic of the object before you, that may be sometimes very apparent, at other times seems to be obscure, then I find that you're in the form of thought itself, right? And these are just points that you can find in some of the best critical theory. It's not a muddle, it's not a ambiguity or just some kind of vagueness. I find that to be so rampant in certain bodies of theory, which are very dominant actually. And I find that that's kind of fashionable. People get into it. It comes in and out. It falls by the wayside. Books are published, they become trash just a year later. they take up space in the library and then have to be, done away with. But other forms of thought seem to last. And so even some of the books that I cited, they're old, but they have more staying power and have, greater sort of capacity for actually producing solid sort of critical theory or social history or literary history than all of the fashionable, jargonistic works that are rampant today ever could have combined. You know what I mean? So and some of this is kind of going against the grain of some of the, fashions of our time. Those things kind of come and go. They have no real, I think, thought really guiding them. Other considerations actually predominate. I won't go in. I will get myself in trouble if I say anything more along these lines. But you might be able to fill in the blanks. But form is it's something we have to be a little bit more sensitive to, I think, even in studying South Asian stuff. And once you kind of get into the richness of it, and Urdu literature has so many rich forms,
right.
From the standard ghazals and things of that sort to much sort of arcane kinds of forms, marsiya, that's just in the realm of poetry. Then you have short stories, you have novels, you have autobiographical works, as well as like biographical sketches. This is such a rich terrain, and we've only just begun to kind of scratch that surface and think deeply about what kind of social logic is behind the genesis of these forms. And that's something that I think is still a task in a whole variety of contexts around in world literature. And it's what makes aesthetic.
Yes. Sorry, go on. Yeah.
I just think that's one thing that makes aesthetic theory so powerful, that it actually falls out. All of a sudden, you're outside of aesthetic theory and you're dealing with the plight of women in society in this instance. You sort of move very gradually. If you just follow that train of thought dialectically, you go right into the innermost facets, the innermost sorts of realms of social life. And I think Schwarz is so great for kind of bridging these two polarities so well. Anyways, I can go on, but
right.
I'll stop.
I think something that struck me you were talking about the logistics of how theory circulates under conditions of global capitalism. How is it that someone like Spivak can end up in Sao Paulo, but someone like Schwarz will find difficulty in ending up in South Asia. So I was wondering, there is these logistics also are shared by how literature circulates, because the circulation of all of this post-colonial theory has been accompanied by the circulation of, let's say, someone like Rushdie, who has become like a poster boy. So, the canon formation goes hand in hand with a certain kind of canonization of theoretical concepts as well, like hybridity or something like that. Whereas miniaturists, for example, Rajinder Singh Bedi, don't find a place in the canons of world literature. And so that is something that I was thinking about, that, so I want to ask that, how is it that you ended up working on Bedi for this essay? Was it something that, was it like a thought out decision, or did you just fall into it? Or
that's a good question. Some of this came from an invitation that I got from the University of British Columbia to give a lecture. Okay. And I wanted to, speak to some of the concerns around women, since all of the rape controversies were coming up in Delhi.
Right.
And so this is 2014, 2015. And so this was just a moment when all these questions, were coming to a head, and we had to kind of reflect back on the longer trajectory of, say, post-colonial societies, the maintenance of some kinds of gender norms that were very maybe problematic and leading to these kinds of, the most extreme way to these rape and these atrocities. And I find Bedi is especially fascinating because he doesn't really have stereotyped characters. And so Professor Gurmukh Singh just mentioned a while back Lajvanti, right? Lajvanti. And this is one of the classic stories that Bedi wrote. And so the women kind of break out of their sort of stereotyped forms where their kind of individuality is kind of in some sense negated, and they become like full figures that have very particular characteristics. And so this is the kind of thing that Bedi is most known for in the Urdu kind of canon. And I sort of latched onto him for that. And I started to follow what his work was like in the Bombay film industry. And a film like Abhiman, for instance, from the 70s, is actually a Bedi, screenplay. And so you see the kind of how it moves from the realm of the, from the literary into the popular mass culture in India. And Bedi was very fascinating for bringing out the problematics of, say, gender inequality and its reversals, women coming up on top in the context of Abhiman. And one thing just led to another, and I kind of returned to him, and I want to maybe eventually compile a variety of essays over the course and just have nothing too sort of conventional, but maybe just like aspects of a kind of literary film career in the realms of Urdu, Punjabi, just shown through the figure of Bedi. I think that would be a fascinating book. So I've just written little chunks, and this just ended up becoming one kind of combination of certain bodies of research that I had done. And but I would like this to also extend to other writers. This isn't just meant, but this is all I can do, I think. And I should grab my Bedi, Majmuai, or Kulayat Bedi, I forget exactly the title. And we can see sort of how vast that corpus is and how rich the kind of possibilities are for a literary theory that actually responds not to the kind of hegemonic norms of post-colonial theory, whatever that is. It applies much more to the Anglophone world. It applies much more to, contexts that are not really on the ground in peripheral locations. Oddly, you think that it would. It doesn't. And so you have to kind of push that aside and get into things that are even richer than what the post-colonial theorists, who themselves are oftentimes at odds with themselves and don't even have much of a coherent sort of sense of what they're doing. I think, there's a kind of repetition of the same tropes over and over again that make no sense after a while. You have to be a kind of a believer, already have faith in what and say Derrida as a kind of academic cult leader to really get into it. If you don't have that faith, then it just seems like gibberish. And so I've been trying to avoid the gibberish. It's not the best of career moves in the American Academy, where the gibberish is thought to be what everyone ought to speak. So it's my own kind of resistance to the hegemonies of neoliberal society in our own midst. Again, I'm getting myself in trouble, but I'll just leave that there. Hopefully this might, kind of get those people
May I ask a question or two?
Sure.
Yes, absolutely.
There are so many. I mean, your paper was really interesting. And of course, I mean, one question is with reference to this section where you talk about the genus-faced, nature of the colonial power, and the references to that. On the one hand side, there was the logic of capital, and on the other hand side, there was the colonial logic of the ruling power. So the logic of capital was more or less moving towards the opening up of possibilities, but the ruling powers contained that logic. Now, how do you understand this? I mean, how are we to really appreciate or understand this assumption that the logic of the liberal capitalist market was leading towards something progressive, and the ruling power somehow constricted it? because it wanted to legitimize itself or because of its own longevity. I mean, how are we to deal with this? And the second is with reference to Niladri Bhattacharya's observation that, I mean, this desire of the ruling powers to constrain the possibilities opened up by the introduction of the logic of capital somehow played a negative role in the perpetuation of the subjugation of women, and in the pre let's say colonial world, women had more freedom, they had more rights somehow. There is a reference that those were customary rights, and as a because of the colonial interventions there was a major change in that. I mean, how are we to understand this? Because this is not something specific to the post-colonial space only. Wherever there were agrarian societies, I think the situation of women was different. And there is a reference to the English countryside also in David McKelney's book Against the Market, that the role of women in social and political and cultural life was definitely different than what it became after industrialization and the advent of capitalism. So we can see that something that was there in the post-colonial space was there in the heart of capital in England. So how do we really understand this? I mean, is it something unique about the the post-capitalist cultural or political or social space that women somehow had more freedom, but the colonial intervention played a very negative role and perpetuated it in a different form, the subjugation of women? I mean, that is the question, if I am able to communicate.
That's a very fascinating question. It's a very large, and we don't have much time. I know it's late there. I could go on ad infinitum about some of these things, but we can take the American context, I think, as a kind of maybe in some sense an interesting one to look at for comparative purposes. You have some notions of like the incorporation of the ex-slave populations into the nation state as citizens. They're given citizen rights, with the 14th Amendment after Civil War, right? Then you have women also then sort of demanding similar rights. They're kind of incorporated into the citizenry. That becomes the narrative for all these different sorts of groups, that they're going to be kind of incorporated into the kind of liberal citizenry of the nation state, have formally equal rights with all other sort of citizens within that context. And then turn to India, and under colonial rule, you have notions of equality circulating, the sphere of circulation as giving rise ever more to notions of equality between figures, from Dalits to Brahmins, as well as women and men of all kinds. Yet the very idea of women under colonial rule getting something like citizen-like rights, citizenship, and the right to vote, and some things of that sort seems so far beyond. I don't know if you can even find any instances in the archive of colonial discourse of some kind of program to give women equal rights. So the contradictions seem to be much stronger, much starker in these colonial contexts between something like a manufactured, kind of concocted, customary set of norms on the one hand, and then the very possibility of rights that are kind of held back on the other. And so we start to see this kind of uneven sort of a landscape of capitalist societies. Those that are at the metropolitan center seem to give way to something like bourgeois social norms for all the various subjects, at least an inkling of that possibility. In other contexts, say in India, say Punjab in the 1940s, I don't even know if in that instance, in the 1940s, any kind of program is put forth, aside from the progressives, for anything like women equality. And that's interesting just to think about how uneven capitalism develops in different contexts. There's no way to really generalize. So, about these things, you can only kind of think in this context that seems to evolve in this fashion. Other contexts, because of the force of colonial rule and the imperative to hold back on the very processes unleashed by colonial rule, those same rights are sort of held in check. And I'm not sure what more to say about that, but you can see that this is a very contradictory realm. And
Right.
we can't take basically the point that I should make regarding what was said earlier, what Aditya brought up about canons of post-colonial theory, is that they have another sort of set of norms, and they have, Anglophone literature in the European context and other sorts of canons undergirding them. And the theories that they come up with that kind of material has very little applicability to the actual colonial and post-colonial societies that are non-Anglophone at their base. So that makes sense. So that's why you can't, so post-colonial theory, in other words, becomes just as inapplicable, just as misplaced as sort of the liberal colonial theory that preceded it. And that's where you see its limitations. And I think those who don't see those limitations don't see them to their own detriment and even distort what they are actually reading, according to the post-colonial theories of, say, Baba or Spivak or whoever the latest name might be. It's just waning fashions at this point in time. So I think that's the point to take from that you can't just sort of, this would be fully anti-Schwarzian, just to kind of apply from one realm, the theories of one realm onto another as if they work for that other realm. They don't. And this shows the post-colonial theory might be a misnomer in many ways. It may not even actually deal that much with the societies of ex-colonial states.
I mean,
Again,
Nivedita Majumdar has come up with a book, The World in a Grain of Sand, and Post-Colonial Theory and Radical Universalism. And that is also an attempt to, kind of question the legacies of post-colonial theory and the manner in which it has developed in the recent decades. And she claims that it is possible to capture or trace radical universalism, which means that whatever is coming from the West cannot be seen as Eurocentric blindly. There are possibilities of appropriating the universalist possibilities that have developed in the West, and they could be seen or they were appropriated in a singular context, of course, with reference to different societies and cultures. But that again is an attempt to question the hegemony of the post-colonial theory and the way the manner in which it has categorized everything that has been coming from the West as Eurocentric. Because in Roberto Schwartz's case also there is an appropriation. Or for instance, of Adorno. I mean, Adorno, of course, is we can all agree, is rooted in the Western, epistemological and philosophical tradition, and whatever is referring to comes from there only. But that is a different kind of engagement with Adorno, where we are not really trying to categorize him as Eurocentric blindly.
Right.
Maybe there are his limitations. We can agree on that, but there are some possibilities that you can make use of. Vis-a-vis your own conditions and specificities.
Right. Yeah, he just has to be put into dialogue with other thinkers. That's what Schwarz did by just putting him into dialogue with Candido.
One last question, sir. One last question from my side. Is there a possibility of reclaiming, because there has been a reference to Hegel also in your presentation, and Hegel is all for concrete universality, which of course is a reference to singularity. So is it really possible for all of us to reclaim universalism in the 21st century context and the kind of world in which we exist today? And is there a reference to something like this in Roberto Schwarz writings, that there is a possibility that we can reclaim universalism, not, I mean, pluriversality, it's a different kind of problem, pluriversality or the decolonial project or the multiple modernities project, they have all been there. So is it really possible to reclaim universalism? With reference to, of course, the South Asian or the peripheral geographies, that they can also claim universal ideals.
Right. I think the concluding comments that I made in this paper sort of are reflective of this question. I think that's where your question is sort of maybe stemming from. And what I would say is that maybe it's better not to think so much about the categories or sort of conceptual levels regarding these problems of universality, but to think about the actual social processes and whether they have a kind of universal impact. So capitalism, is now global. It would be foolhardy to think that we can just escape it through some kind of ideation of, being particular or separate, or, that is folly through and through. And the practices and sort of social processes sometimes exceed our own conceptions. They're far ahead of us. And so it's a matter not so much of trying to think whether we can adapt some universality or some notion of the universal coming from Enlightenment theories of European thinkers. No, forget that. That's the 18th century that had its own sort of moment. It was even being eclipsed at that very moment by the expansion of say, the forms of capitalism that were penetrating different societies around the world. It wasn't even able to capture that complexity of its own time. And now we're sort of in a moment when we can't do without the universal. We can't do without thinking in terms of globes and the entire sort of world. And that's because the problems that face us revolve around that level, that scale of experience. The pandemic was everywhere. Climate change and the environmental crisis cannot be fended off by anyone, anywhere in the world so easily, not even Europe. So we're stuck with problems that are sort of universal in scope, global in their essence. And it's a matter of finding what kinds of patterns of thought and modalities of the universal are adequate to these actual experiences of our times. So it's not just some kind of thought. It's not, it's not just some reworking of what Kant may have thought was the universal. Our own experiences far exceed any one model that has been advanced regarding the universal, and that's as problematic, I would say. I'm hoping, this is a very abstract conversation, but I hope it has some traction or intelligibility. These are interesting questions, and I think the essay does lend itself or move into that direction, because it's like, who are the shipwrecked of today? Who will be the shipwrecked of tomorrow? Before, the shipwrecked were just a second order phenomenon of world experience. Now the shipwrecked are becoming ever more commonplace, and they're not located in any single part of the world, despite the radical unevenness of infrastructure that could fend off something like the blight of climate change. These are very interesting questions, excellent questions, I must say. Very, I know you guys are probably sleepy, but you've definitely woken me up with this conversation.
Right. Any question, sir? Gurmukh sir?
ਜੀ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਟਾਈਮ ਬਹੁਤ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ, ਪਰ ਦੋ ਗੱਲਾਂ ਮੈਂ ਜ਼ਰੂਰ ਕੀਤੀਆਂ ਨੇ। ਇੱਕ ਤਾਂ ਮੈਂ ਇਹ ਜਾਣਨਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦਾ ਕਿ ਸਹੋਤਾ ਹੋਰਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਕਿ ਜਦੋਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੀਆਂ ਰਾਈਟਿੰਗਸ ਕਰਦੇ ਹੋ ਤਾਂ ਥਿਊਰੀ ਦੀ ਡੋਮੀਨੈਂਸ ਲਿਟਰੇਚਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਪਰ ਇਸ ਨੂੰ ਧਿਆਨ 'ਚ ਰੱਖਦੇ ਹੋ ਕਿ ਲਿਟਰੇਰੀ ਰਾਈਟਿੰਗ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਆ ਉਹ ਬਹੁਤ ਪਿੱਛੇ ਬਾਅਦ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਉਂਦੀ ਆ, ਸਿਰਫ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ਥਿਓਰੈਟੀਕਲ ਪੁਆਇੰਟ ਆ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਵੈਲੀਡੇਟ ਕਰਨ ਲਈ। ਕਿਤੇ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਤਾਂ ਨਹੀਂ ਵਾਪਰ ਰਹੀ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਲਿਟਰੇਚਰ ਦੀ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਅਹਿਮੀਅਤ ਆ ਉਹ ਦਬ ਰਹੀ ਹੋਵੇ, ਉਹ ਆਟੋਨੋਮਸ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹਦੀ ਹੋਂਦ ਆ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਨੁਕਸਾਨ ਪਹੁੰਚਦਾ ਹੋਵੇ। ਇੱਕ ਗੱਲ ਤਾਂ ਇਹ ਕਿ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਮਨ 'ਚ ਰਹਿੰਦੀ ਹੈ ਗੱਲ ਇਹ ਕਿ ਮੈਂ ਕਿੰਨੀ ਕੁ ਸਪੇਸ ਦੇਣੀ ਹੈ ਥਿਊਰੀ ਨੂੰ ਤੇ ਕਿੰਨੀ ਕੁ ਦੇਣੀ ਹੈ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕ੍ਰੀਏਟਿਵ ਰਾਈਟਿੰਗ ਹੈ। ਤੇ ਦੂਸਰੀ ਗੱਲ ਇਹ ਵੀ ਮੈਂ ਦੇਖਦਾ ਕਿ ਜਿੰਨੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਨੌਜਵਾਨ ਬਾਹਰ ਕੰਮ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ ਡਾਇਸਪੋਰਾ ਰਾਈਟਿੰਗ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਥਿਊਰੀ ਨਾਲ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦਾ ਰਿਸ਼ਤਾ ਤੇ ਕ੍ਰੀਏਟਿਵ ਰਾਈਟਿੰਗ ਨਾਲ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦਾ ਰਿਸ਼ਤਾ, ਕਿ ਉਹ ਕ੍ਰੀਏਟਿਵ ਰਾਈਟਿੰਗ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਨਵੋਲਵ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਆ ਜਾਂ ਕੇਵਲ ਉਹ ਥਿਊਰੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੀ ਇਨਵੋਲਵ ਨੇ। ਜੇ ਉਹ ਥਿਊਰੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਨਵੋਲਵ ਨੇ ਤਾਂ ਕ੍ਰੀਏਟਿਵ ਰਾਈਟਿੰਗ ਵੱਲ ਘੱਟ ਝੁਕਾਅ ਹੋਣ ਦਾ ਕੀ ਕਾਰਨ ਲੱਗਦਾ? ਕਿ ਵੈਸੇ ਤਾਂ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਥਿਊਰੀ ਲਿਖ ਰਿਹਾ ਉਹ ਵੀ ਕ੍ਰੀਏਟੀਵਿਟੀ ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਆ, ਪਰ ਜਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੀ ਲਿਟਰੇਰੀ ਕ੍ਰੀਏਟੀਵਿਟੀ ਉਹ ਇੱਕ ਡਿਫਰੈਂਟ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੀ ਹੈ। ਤੇ ਤੀਸਰੀ ਗੱਲ ਇਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਮੈਂ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਜੋੜਨਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦਾ ਉਹ ਇਹ ਕਿ ਥਿਊਰੀ ਨੂੰ ਸਮਝਦੇ ਆ ਤੇ ਲਿਟਰੇਚਰ ਨੂੰ ਸਮਝਿਆ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਐਕਸਪੀਰੀਅੰਸ ਆ, ਲਾਈਫ ਦਾ ਐਕਸਪੀਰੀਅੰਸ ਆ, ਉਹ ਕੀ ਕੰਟਰੀਬਿਊਟ ਕਰਦਾ ਕਿਸੇ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਨਾਲ? ਜਿਹੜਾ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਡਾਇਸਪੋਰਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜ਼ਿੰਦਗੀ ਜਿਉਂਦਿਆਂ ਹੋਇਆਂ ਭਾਰਤ ਦੀਆਂ ਟੈਕਸਟ ਨੂੰ ਪੜ੍ਹਨਾ, ਉਹਨੂੰ ਪੜ੍ਹਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਨਿੱਜੀ ਜ਼ਿੰਦਗੀ ਦਾ ਐਕਸਪੀਰੀਅੰਸ ਆ ਉਹਦੀ ਕਿੰਨੀ ਕੁ ਭੂਮਿਕਾ ਬਣਦੀ ਆ। ਤਾਂ ਇਹਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਜੇ ਕੁਝ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਚਾਹੋ।
पता नहीं मैं कित्थों शुरू करूं, लेकिन काफी मुश्किल सवाल ने। You know, I'm very sensitive to this question that you brought up. You know, the work of art should not just be an occasion for validating your own theories. It should be a moment for you to reflect back on whether your theories are even adequate to the questions that the work of art is posing. Can it respond to the work of art adequately? So instead of forcing the theory onto the work of art, I try to do the opposite of forcing the work of art onto my theory to maybe rethink whether my theory is valid, not the other way around. I think that's the starting point for a good critical theory of aesthetics. That's crucial for us. That's rarely considered. And as you pointed out, there may be some points when the creative work has theory kind of embedded within it. There's not a sort of a non-conceptual, zone of creativity in the literary work. It is also embedded or has embedded within it some kind of philosophical notions, presuppositions, concepts, and so forth. And what the task of the theorist should be is to be sensitive to those and lay them out and give sort of wrest them out of the context of the literary work or the aesthetic work and give them a sort of sense of, you could say, distension or a sense of, of autonomy even from the creativity. That's an interesting thing to think about. For instance, now we're in the program age. People say in the American literature, creative writing is now completely controlled by the creative writing programs. You used to have creative writing that was autonomous from the university. Authors spoke to direct audiences. There was maybe universities didn't even care what, say, in the American context, a figure like, I don't know, Emily Dickinson was even doing. It didn't resonate with the university context in that era. And now that's probably less likely. So the very literature that is being produced as creative writing has sort of absorbed actually the norms and the kind of underlying concepts and theories about creativity. It is not autonomous from those. It's actually just sort of, you get the stamp of approval of various authorities in creative writing to the extent that the work that is produced matches exactly the concepts around creativity produced by creative writing programs. So it's a kind of controlling of creativity rather than letting it free and be sort of able to extend in spontaneous and creative ways. beyond the confines of creative writing, it has to match the norms of creative writing for it to succeed. And so the task of the critical theorist then is to figure out what are these concepts of creativity in creative writing. Are they even creative? Do they even match the criterion of creativity? And what kinds of possibilities are being blocked essentially by the notion of creativity as implemented in creative writing programs? Does that make sense? I find that that's where it's critical. So the critical theory then is actually more creative than the creative writing because it's able to map on possible horizons of possibility that are foreclosed within creative writing. And this is, creative writing people do not like to hear this. They like to think that they're special and more creative than critical theorists. Actually, they're just oftentimes unwitting participants in programs that are actually sapping their creativity. This is the sad thing about our times, So I'm somewhat critical of this whole notion of creative writing as it's being produced in the American context. All of the questions that you've asked have gotten me into a lot of trouble, I must say. I'll be less liked in my own environment here at UCSC for all the things that I've said, but I don't really care. That's not really the point. I'm not interested in any popularity contest. Actual critical theory is more important for me than popularity contests. I hope these are very interesting questions. Then the last one about, the Niji Zindagi, I am, in some ways as being maybe diasporic, I probably don't know this. Perhaps you might be able to sense it more than I do, but I want to bridge these worlds in certain, I don't, much of this stuff, doesn't really seem to have much traction here. There are very few Indian languages taught. Only one really, sponsored by the community, not by the university. No one knows who Rajinder Singh Bedi is in this entire university, I'm sure. And very few people care, especially those who might be even doing world literature. And so that gives me a sense of how limited, this environment is, how sort of enclosed and kind of even provincial, that they don't even have any inkling of the very deep and rich creativity that's happening in other parts of the world. And some sense trying to critique this world vis-a-vis that one, and in some respects that world vis-a-vis this one, and trying in some sense to fashion something new, very much in alignment with what the Vice Chancellor had brought up, that the two can be very productive together. So the Niji Zindagi wala सवाल बहुत महत्वपूर्ण है, लेकिन पता नहीं कि मैं चंगी तरह सवाल का जवाब दे सकता हूँ क्योंकि हम असी आप बारे किन्ने जानते हैं. We don't quite fully know ourselves in this context. I hope that's very interesting questions. Lovely conversation. I don't want to keep you guys awake. I'm always ready to continue, but if you want to close up, feel free. I know it's late there.
So now we have moved towards the end of this engaging conversation, and I hope we'll keep in touch in the future also. And whenever you are here, sir, please do let us know. We'll love to host you. So I'll now give the formal vote of thanks. So I will start by thanking Professor G.S. Sahota ji for sparing his time to be with us. And I would also like to thank Aditya Bahal for taking his time out on such a short notice. We are thankful. And I would also like to thank Professor Arvind, our Vice Chancellor, who has been a great support for us at the Center for Diaspora Studies. And finally, I would like to thank Professor Gurmukh, Director, Center for Diaspora Studies, whose inspiration and guidance has been the source of light for at least me here in the Diaspora Center. Thanks a lot.